I'm Dr. Keith Delaplane, Extension Entomologist and Honeybee Specialist at the University of Georgia. And I'm glad you could join me for another session in our series, Honeybees and Beekeeping, as we continue to look at a year in the life of an apiary. The main goal of bee management is to maximize colony populations before the major nectar flows begin. If their population needs are satisfied, bees turn the nectar into surplus honey that we can harvest instead of using it to make more bees. In this part of the country, almost all the nectar comes in during the months of April and May, and that doesn't leave us much time. We must push the colonies to grow fast, or we may miss an entire honey crop. In our last show, we installed the packaged bees in their hives, and these young colonies are now bursting with activity. Workers are building comb, and the queens are laying eggs non-stop. We must feed the colonies, medicate them, and watch closely for any problems. In this program, we watch the normal development of new colonies, and we see the first new workers emerge. We see the populations swell, and before we know it, it's time for the nectar flow. We add honey supers and even move the hives to another area to collect a very special kind of honey, sourwood. This is the busiest time of year for a beekeeper, so sit back, enjoy, and let's see what happens. Before you even enter the hive, take a look at the entrance. Bees are bringing in large amounts of pollen. Notice the balls of pollen on their legs. The hind legs of a worker have a structure called the pollen basket. As a bee visits a flower, it collects pollen with its front legs and mouth parts. Pollen is passed down to the rear legs and forced into the pollen basket. Back at the hive, the bee removes the pollen pellet with its middle legs, places it in a cell, and house bees pack it in tightly. It's always a good sign when you see bees collecting pollen. This usually means the queen is well, and the colony is rearing brood. Queenless bees without brood are not motivated to collect pollen. Before we go any further, let's talk about the development stages a young bee goes through. First, the queen lays an egg in the bottom of the cell. 3 days later, it will hatch into a tiny larva. Workers feed these young larvae pollen and a secretion called brood food. They grow quickly, and when they fill most of the cell, the workers cap the cell. The larva then transforms into a pupa. This is a quiet, non-feeding stage that somewhat resembles the future adult. Several days later, the pupa molts into an adult, which emerges from the cell. Development times for workers, drones, and queens vary. It's been 1 week since we released the queens, and now's the time to check colony growth. By this time, there should be white wax combs under construction. These cells contain sugar syrup, pollen, eggs, and young larvae. Here's the queen. Notice how she stands out from the workers. Because she is longer, her thorax is bigger, and her abdomen is elongated and looks like leather. This young queen is still pretty nervous. Mature queens move more slowly around the comb as they look for empty cells in which to lay eggs. At first, you may have trouble finding the queen, but with experience, you'll find her more quickly. When you work a hive, assume the queen is on every frame you pick up. That way, you will work more gently and reduce the chance of accidentally killing her. This is a good-looking young colony. It means that we're going to be successful beekeepers. While I'm here, I need to be sure there's plenty of protein supplement and sugar syrup. As this colony grows, I'll add a second hive body and eventually some honey supers. But not quite yet. Oh, they're a little nervous acting. Kind of runny and flying a lot. At least they have nectar and pollen, but I don't see any eggs. This colony's not doing so well. They're loud, kind of nervous acting, and no eggs or larvae. And that means the queen must be dead. We still have time to salvage this colony, but we're going to have to move quickly to get another queen in there. I'm going to order another queen and call my supplier. In the meantime, though, I'll take a frame of brood from this strong colony. This is a good frame. It has lots of eggs and lots of larvae in it. I have to check and be sure I don't accidentally take the queen. Well, the queen's not on this frame, so I'm going to shake off all the workers. And then take this frame of brood and slide it in here into this queenless colony. And replace this frame over here. Stocking brood in this queenless colony will help boost its population and maintain it until the new queen arrives. It's never a good idea to steal brood from a colony, but the benefits to this queenless colony far outweigh the costs to the donor colony. It's been about 2 weeks since we released the queens, and it's time to check brood development again. Last week we found that new wax cells had been built and were filled with eggs, young larvae, and sugar syrup. Well, this week we find many more eggs and larvae and something else, capped brood. As the larvae matured, the bees that we installed capped the larvae cells with a wax seal. In a 2-week period, the larvae then gradually transform into adults, similar to a caterpillar in a cocoon. Young bees will emerge from these cells in about another week. The sealed brood looks like brown cardboard. The sealed syrup is easily distinguished from the brood. Eventually, this syrup will get used and will be replaced with nectar, which will become honey. This colony has a good queen. By that, I am referring to her meticulous pattern of filling most every cell with an egg, rarely skipping one. The queen of this colony, however, was not nearly as meticulous, as can be seen by the irregular brood pattern. We build our supers following a square box design for our convenience, but the bees build their nest in a spherical design. At the center is sealed brood. It's sealed because this is where the queen began laying eggs first. She then radiates outward as she continues to lay. Therefore, the brood is progressively younger as you move outward. The cycle will begin again as the brood in the middle begins to emerge. The queen will then begin laying eggs in the center again. Above and to the sides of the brood is a thin layer of pollen. This is the protein that fuels brood production. The larvae are fed this pollen. Nurse bees also eat the pollen, which stimulates them to secrete brood food, which they generously feed each larva. The frames are then filled out with honey or sugar syrup. Some of it will be capped, and some will not. This is because bees evaporate excess moisture from the liquid. This is done by fanning the cells with their wings. When the moisture content is reduced to 18%, they will cap the cells. These serve as the carbohydrate or energy stores for the colony. Today we'll go back into the hives to observe their development. 3 weeks ago today we released the queen, and since it takes 21 days for a bee to develop from an egg to a young adult, we may have some bees emerging from their cells. That is, assuming that our queen started laying eggs on her first day. Apparently she did, as there are bees emerging on this frame. So in this case, bees emerged after 21 days, almost to the hour. Remember that during the producing season, the lifespan of these honeybees is only 6 weeks, maybe as little as 3 weeks. An emerging bee chews through her capping and climbs out without any help from other bees. They are light-colored, and their hairs are matted together. For a few hours, her exoskeleton, or cuticle, is very soft. So soft, in fact, that she cannot sting. As a bee ages, it performs a series of tasks in a predictable sequence. On average, the first task is capping cells of brood. Next, the bees clean cells, then tend to the brood, tend to the queen, receive incoming nectar, clean out hive debris, take their first orientation flight, build comb, receive incoming pollen, ventilate the hive with their wings, guard the entrance, and finally, begin foraging for nectar and pollen. Foraging is the most dangerous job because bees expose themselves to predators, pesticides, and bad weather. At this stage, bees literally work themselves to death, and you will find the ground in front of your hives littered with their dead, worn-out bodies. We have intentionally waited 3 weeks because bees prefer to build vertically rather than horizontally, and they would have built up only the center combs and moved up into the second hive body before they would have built out all the combs in the first hive body. We want them to completely occupy the first hive body because that encourages construction of a large brood nest and, consequently, large populations. Our colonies have been in place for 7 weeks. It's been 4 weeks since we added the second hive body. Notice how the bees have maintained the spherical shape of their nest, even into the second hive body. Not all beekeepers use 2 hive bodies. In the South, many beekeepers use just 1 because bees don't need as much space for a large winter food supply. With just 1 hive body, hives are lighter and easier to move, and it's easier to find the queen and medicate. On the other hand, 2 hive bodies supply abundant space for rearing brood and storing food. It really boils down to your personal preference. In this series, we start with 2 hive bodies and later switch to just 1. Our intensive feeding and medicating program has promoted this fast population growth. The bees have collected enough nectar for themselves, and now they are strong enough to start collecting surplus nectar for us. The incoming nectar that the bees will store in this shallow super is our harvestable honey. We won't take honey from the hive bodies because the bees will need this later in the year. The queen might move into this honey super and lay eggs alongside cells of nectar. That's not really a problem because brood can be filtered out during the harvesting process. However, many beekeepers don't like brood in their honey supers. If you plan on using a queen excluder, install it between the hive body and the honey supers. As the name implies, the queen excluder restricts the motion of the queen. Workers can pass through this grate, but drones and the queen are too large. However, I prefer not to use a queen excluder because I think it slows down the process of storing honey. You may have noticed that this honey super has only 9 frames. When using frames of drawn foundation, that is, foundation on which the bees have already built, I like to allow extra space between the frames. The bees use this extra space to build thicker combs, which are easier at harvesting time. However, with new foundation, you have to use all 10 frames. Before we could get to this point, it was important that we made sure that our honey would not be contaminated by the medications we were using. Our last terramycin dusting was more than 5 weeks ago, and, if you remember, the manufacturer recommends allowing at least 4 weeks between the last application and putting on the honey supers. So we know we are safe there. We've also been feeding the colonies sugar syrup with Fumidil B. The manufacturer of that medication says don't use it immediately before or during a honey flow. Well, to be extra safe, we stopped over 2 weeks ago when our syrup supply ran out. So, we can rest assured that our honey will be pure, wholesome, and free of any contamination from the medications. Earlier, we were talking about the incoming nectar. Nectar is the sweet liquid secreted by flowers of various plants. Bees gather the nectar and turn it into honey. Nectar determines the flavor of the honey. For instance, around here there's a lot of clover, and if the bees were to gather this nectar, we would have clover honey. But the tulip poplar trees are blossoming right now, and we know from beekeeping records of this area that the bees are probably getting that nectar. We are going to transport these colonies to the North Georgia mountains later this season, when the nectar from sourwood trees is flowing. Sourwood honey is one of my favorites, and I'm looking forward to it. Knowing when there is a nectar flow is almost second nature to a veteran beekeeper. These are the signs which indicate there is a nectar flow. The bees aren't drinking syrup because they are getting nectar. They're very gentle, and they're very industrious because they are preoccupied with their work. There are a lot of bees festooning, that is, they hook together and form long chains. Wax scales on bee bellies, white wax on the frames, and no robbing behavior because they have enough of their own. And now for some honey and bee trivia. A queen bee lays up to 2,000 eggs per day, and her mere presence in the hive makes workers live longer, resist disease, and forage more for pollen and nectar. It has now been 4 weeks since we added the honey supers to these hives. By now, these supers should be full of honey. In fact, there should be at least another honey super on each hive. But as you can see, there isn't a drop of surplus honey in these supers. Well, what has gone wrong? Well, actually, nothing has gone wrong. This is something that can happen to newly established package colonies. So actually, I'm glad this has happened to us here. This way, you can benefit from our experience and plan a course of action if this should happen to you. Remember that we bought our bees from a supplier and installed them in hives in early spring. If our colonies had been mature and fully built up, they would have stored that early nectar as honey that we could have harvested. However, young packaged colonies are at a disadvantage compared to fully mature colonies that come through the winter. These immature colonies used that early nectar to make more brood and bees instead of honey for us. In this area, the eastern Piedmont of Georgia, the main nectar flows from tulip poplar, which occurs in April and May. So here we are, the 1st of June. The bees are ready to start storing nectar, but there's no nectar flow. Well, fortunately, there is another chance to make a honey crop this year. It will require more work and planning, but the payoff should be well worth it. We're going to move the hives to the mountains of North Georgia, where the bees can collect nectar from the soon-to-be flowering sourwood trees. Sourwood grows throughout the southern Appalachian Mountains. Its nectar is light, the honey is flavorful, and many consider it to be the best honey made in the United States. Lots of beekeepers move their hives to areas with good nectar flows, and even hobbyists can find that worthwhile. When you're moving bees, you want to trap all bees inside the hives, but at the same time, keep hives well ventilated to prevent suffocation. Close up hives just before the move in late evening or early morning when bees are not flying and it's cooler. We're beginning our preparation for moving in the late evening. During summer evenings, bees cluster outside the hive entrance, much like people sitting on their front porch. If you leave these bees behind, there will be a pile of lost, disoriented bees on the ground the next morning. So, puff them with your smoker to drive them inside, then close up the entrance with a screen. Use a piece of window screen cut to fit the opening. Fold it lengthwise and insert it in the entrance. Stuff the corners with wadded newspaper to make the screen fit tightly. Seal other openings and cracks with duct tape. You must fasten the supers together with special hive staples. Don't trust the propolis and beeswax to hold the hive together. And here's a word of caution. Don't nail the staples parallel to each other, because they will then act as hinges and the boxes will come apart. Here's the extra work part. This is definitely a two-person job. Carefully lift the entire hive by the bottom board, trying not to jostle it around too much. The bees will get angry and protective, so take precautions. Secure the hives on the trailer to prevent any movement. Remember to take everything you'll need to reestablish the hives, including the concrete blocks. By moving our hives, we have become migratory beekeepers. This is not at all unusual. In fact, thousands of beehives are trucked all over the United States each year as beekeepers catch different nectar flows. For example, a beekeeper in North Dakota may move his hives to Florida in early spring to get orange honey, then return his hives north in time to get clover honey. By moving bees, a beekeeper can maximize his crop and collect different varieties of honey. When you arrive at the new site, set up the hives with the same care as when you first established them. Now, some more honey and bee trivia. 2,000 commercial beekeepers in the United States rent almost 2 million colonies each year for crop pollination. This represents 60 billion bees. Properly maintained beehives are aesthetically pleasing in a landscape, and beekeepers should always keep up a good image of their craft to non-beekeeping neighbors. This includes mowing the grass. With a few precautions, grass in front of beehives can be mowed with little disturbance to the bees. Always aim the lawnmower so that the clippings and exhaust vent away from the hive entrance. Clippings and exhaust blown into the entrance infuriate bees. For this reason, I always walk the mower backwards when I'm cutting grass at the hive entrance. This allows me to pass the entrance before the bees emerge, after the lawnmower has passed. Wear a veil. With the noise from the lawnmower, you can't hear a bee that is threatening you, and without a veil, you may get stung without warning. It's been a busy spring with a lot of hard work, but now the hives have a good chance to make a honey crop. This would not have been possible without our intense management. Let's go over the most important points. Remember, our goal is to maximize colony populations before the major nectar flows. We do this by feeding bees, medicating them, and making sure each hive has an egg-laying queen. In a way, we did not succeed at this because the hives were still growing while the tulip poplar trees were blooming, so we didn't get any surplus poplar honey. But we have another chance. The hives are now at full strength and on location in the mountains for the imminent sourwood bloom. If the weather cooperates, we should have a very sweet reward for all our labors. I'm glad you joined us today, and I hope you watch again.